English translation 667th contact, Thursday, the 8th of December 2016, 21:48 hours.
Be welcome and greeted, Ptaah, dear friend. What has brought you here today? Because your coming is really unexpected.
Yes, it was also not planned that I would come here again as early as today, but there is something arising that I must discuss with you, something which is really important. But you too be greeted, Edward, my friend.
If it is that important, then
Yes, but it is not official.
that only really changes that much, that we only talk about it among ourselves and then the whole thing will not be retrieved and not written down. But since it seems to be really very important, you might as well immediately start with what you have to bring up.
That is what I want, and it is really very important because
The whole thing is really not for the ears of the public because it would provoke anxiety. But how? Yes, but it is. That is clear. And it is good that you came here because of that, revealed and explained everything, and that we could discuss it deeply. That was indeed important, as you said.
it has now all been a bit long-winded, if you therefore do not have anything else.
Actually, I do, and the more than 1 hour we have now spent talking has not discouraged me from asking my questions, which I still have, which I had however not intended to bring up with you today. But during your next visit, which I had not expected until the 15th of December for the correction of the contact reports, as you announced on the 5th of December. But since you are asking about it now, I want to ask the following. What will take place now concerning the imbecility in the USA with the recounting of the electoral votes for Trump, whereby Mrs. Is that now off the table for good?
The case is absolutely clear. Following which Trump of the right is elected as President of the USA, and that without hacking and vote rigging or miscounting of ballots, as is maliciously claimed by all the Clinton hangers-on. Trump will not be made uncertain by these dirty machinations, just as he will also select his co-workers to suit his mind. Despite all evil hostilities against him and his decrees, something that will create plenty of evil aggressions among the Republicans and also among the Democrats. And this is related to the fact that Trump is Russia-friendly and tends to have peaceful relations with Russia, which is why he will appoint as Secretary of State a man named Rex Tillerson, who is a friend of Russian President Putin, namely the head of the largest Texan, that is to say American Energy Group, meaning mineral oil group, of ExxonMobil.
This could, of course, cause a lot of trouble in the Russia-hostile US-America. Also, Trump and his co-workers will have a hard time implementing all of what Trump intends to do in a good way for the peace of the world, and to make the USA a good America again.
That time will tell. But it will not be easy for the new president of the USA, nor for his co-workers, because various intelligence services and politicians with might will be working against Trump and by means of intrigues be striving to force him to do what they want.
This I can vividly imagine, because it was the same with Obama, who was completely turned inside out, because he was too weak and too soft for the post of president. Consequently, he could be forced to do other things than what he actually promised and wanted to do. One can only hope that Trump will not let himself be cut down to size. But look here, I have a newspaper article that Occam Wolf sent. If you would be so kind to read it and then say what needs to be said about it, please.
Ptaah reads.
Researchers, increase in caesarean sections influences evolution. Doctors newspaper, Tuesday, the 6th of December, 2016, 15:57 Universal Time Coordinated.
Provocative statement by researchers. Caesarean sections pass on unfavorable genes. But the scientists do not want to condemn sectiocaesarea. In EU Eisenberg, more and more children cannot be born in the natural way, according to a study as reported by BBC. The reason? The expectant mothers have too narrow a pelvis. The babies simply do not fit through the birth canal. While this was the case in 3% of births in the 1960s, it would be between 10 and 20% more today. Biologist Dr. Michael Mitteracker from the University of Vienna therefore sees a connection between caesarean sections and evolution. In the past, women with too narrow a pelvis and their children would have died during the birth. Thus, they would not have passed on the genes for a too narrow birth canal. That is from an evolutionary perspective selection, says Mitteracker. Babies are getting bigger and bigger. The feasibility of giving birth to such children by caesarean section would therefore influence the evolution. The trend would be towards larger newborns, without the mother's pelvises becoming larger. Mitteracker believes that the evolutionary trend will continue, albeit only very slowly, and that the majority of babies can still be born naturally. Audio source, de.sut.net.
What is written here corresponds effectively to the facts, although various other factors are not mentioned, including the resulting atrophy of the values of life that are necessary for the existence of life. The lives of those born by caesarean section will over time become more and more difficult to live, because in future times many will increasingly lose the life sense and become more inconstant in life, which will in fact have to do with a continuous weakening of life. If they are unable to share all that they do every day with a single human being on the earth, then it will be bad for them. If the ones born by caesarean section would in coming times have to decide everything on their own and would not get any help from others, then their life would become a torment. The life must always be worth living. But much of what is worth living is over the course of time lost through degeneration if no natural birth takes place, which is for every human being of Earth as important as the air to breathe. It is an effective fact that human beings are social beings, who can only lead a happy, satisfied, and life-worthy life in the community with other human beings, and this is also only feasible if the human beings are, on the whole, of an equal nature. Through caesarean section, however, the human beings change in multifarious regards. Consequently, discrepancies arise between the ones born by caesarean section and the ones born normally. And this also in a physical respect, as well as that the women become more and more incapable of still giving normal births. Because as described in the article, their birth canal becomes narrower and narrower. Descendants who, because of this, have to be born by a caesarean section, suffer multifarious disadvantages, and namely among other things also in moral and physical respects. Wherethrough, genetically inherited, they become more and more inconstant in life and increasingly disadvantage themselves with regard to social relations. But this does not only happen to human beings who are born by caesarean section, but also to those born normally, because a degeneration is spreading ever worse among the newer and new generations of human beings of Earth, which has the consequence that more and more malignant excesses and perversions come about in the line of succession. The social relationships of a human being are, however, of great importance because these have a decisive effect on the health and the general well-being, as well as on the ever more precarious dealings with fellow human beings. The community in this way becomes more and more the disturbing factor of one's own indefinable interests. Because the indifference towards all and everything, so also with regard to the human beings in general, becomes more and more pronounced. Good and honest relationships are the basis for a life worth living, but the unconcernedness leads to a lack of support from others in their lives. Because gene-wise, more and more often an aversion against one's own genus is transferred to the descendants who are born by caesarean section. This is because the latter can, due to the caesarean section, no longer pass through the necessary processes of the normal birth and consequently cannot withstand the very necessary factors that come about through the normal childbearing and make the human being capable of living in multifarious respects. If the descendants born by caesarean section want to change their lives towards the positive, Then the longer, the more they lack the necessary prerequisites for this, which are conducive to this, but which cannot be built up and only unnecessarily rob the life itself of energy. So whether their life is worth living or not depends on the manner in which they were born, and then above all on how they value their own life situation, which they perceive as fortune or unfortune. However, whether the ones born by cesarean section are able to turn their life around and build up a good quality of life, that depends in every case on their own initiative, which they have to build up to a much greater extent in themselves and make use of than those born normally. But while I am on this subject, I would also like to take my responsibility regarding and kindly ask you to speak and explain the following.
Your justifications may certainly be true, as well as your worries, all of which I can understand. Therefore, I will grant your wish and talk to.
I was not expecting anything else because I know that you are also worried.
Of course, but you spoke earlier on of quality of life, yet I think that for very many earthlings this has become nothing more than a wish, just like the feeling of happiness.
As for the quality of life itself, it must be said that there are a lot of definitions of it, which always depends on the terminological approach of the human being in question. If, for example, the quality of life is seen primarily as state of health, then this attitude can also be reflected in the definition applied by the human being, whereby the form of birth plays a significant role. Actually, it must be understood as the satisfaction with the life. Consequently, a definition is to be formulated that also expresses this satisfaction. The effective quality of life thereby is the extent of the general satisfaction with life, which is positive or negative, but which is determined by the perception of the specific aspects that are important for the human being and by which he or she is specifically also influenced by his or her cesarean or normal birth. About this, however, the earthly scientific community has not yet gained any cognition whatsoever, which is also why it cannot provide any cognitions about it, and also cannot be in agreement about it. Also, with regard to the definition of quality of life, the human beings of Earth in general, and the corresponding scientists in particular, are not in agreement. Because fundamentally it is for all of them not important to know what is actually meant and must be associated with the term quality of life. Quality of life cannot be measured in any way for the human beings of Earth. Consequently, they do not, as a rule, have a clear answer to this. In fact, there is a connection between the state of health of the human being and his or her quality of life. However, the two are not the same, whereby it must also be paid attention to the fact that the feeling of happiness must also be included thereby, because there is a connection between the short-term feeling of happiness and the quality of life. The feeling of happiness corresponds to a feeling caused by conscious or unconscious thoughts, which can, however, subject to the situation and the conscious or unconscious thought processes, change negatively in a matter of seconds or minutes. Of course, depending on the influence of the level of education and the corresponding situations and circumstances, the quality of life is obviously also changeable, whereby it must be said that this quality of life is many times more stable than the feeling of happiness, which is dependent on the conscious and unconscious world of thoughts. Human beings who dispose of a better education, a better general knowledge, knowledge gained from experience, living of it, life, learning and schooling, and a good cognizance of work have a much better quality of life than an average human being with little or only very little general knowledge of work, etc., who thus shows a poorer quality of life. Human beings who are thoughtful and incontestable, attentive and heedful, who also learn, study, or work a lot in a motivated manner in this way, have a much better quality of life than those who do not do this, only talk for a long time and a lot, constantly repeat themselves in their speeches, thus become a burden to others and miss out on work. In the connection between the quality of life and the position in the working life, It arises, irrespective of the type of work, be it purely manual or consciousness-based, etc., that a human being who carries out much and often work, and indeed also varied work, shows a much better quality of life than those who work ill-temperedly, carelessly, badly, or not at all, and indulge in idleness.
With that you hit a nail on the spot, which applies to many earthlings, especially in the present time. Whereby, however, I think that this probably also has to do with the dwindling intelligence. Already your father Svath spoke of it. It was shortly after the World War in 1945, that due to the horrible war crimes of the Second and Third World Wars, that is to say the one from 1914, 1918, and the one from 1939, 1945, in the majority of earthly humankind a gen-based negative influence would have arisen. From this a genetic damage would arise, which would already variously become apparent in many earthlings, such as through monstrous and horrible perversions of all imaginable kinds. The same as, however, also everything would have an effect on an in the future worldwide spreading impairment of intelligence. A very worrying factor thereby would also be the growing overpopulation, because the more human beings would be born, the more their foolishness and weakness of intelligence would increase. Although the earthly jumping jacks of psychologists and other experts claim that intelligence can neither decrease nor be further developed, Svath taught me something different, namely that the human being can very well reduce his or her intelligence, but also develop it further and thus build it up.
Which in fact is the case.
Could you perhaps explain something more about this?
This matter raised by my father is something we have been following since the beginning of the Second World War in 1914. In this regard, for about 2.5 decades, earthly scientists have also been conducting studies in a lax manner, whereby they, however, assess various important factors according to wrong parameters and consequently come to incorrect results. In all this, the rapidly increasing overpopulation is also not taken into account, through which everything is being brought about in every respect to the detriment of all life. So among many other things, also the atrophy of human intelligence, and indeed to the point of effective foolishness, which is to be understood in multifarious terms.
For which I would once like to say what I understand by this, if you will allow me.
Of course, if that is what you want.
Good, you can correct me if I say something wrong. Foolishness, as Svath taught me, is not simply foolish in the sense in which earthlings actually define it, such as being dumb, shallow-brainedness, being naive, being misguided, and being limited, because foolishness is primarily characterized by a lack of intelligence, in which multifarious factors are anchored, which earthlings actually do not at all take into consideration when they speak of the foolishness of a human being. Dumbness, shallow-brainedness, being misguided and being limited may indeed be defined as foolishness, but not the fact of being naive alone, because this simply means that the human being perceives something unrealistically to some extent whatsoever, or behaves in this way, which has, however, absolutely nothing to do with foolishness. As actual foolishness resulting from weakness of intelligence, in my view, this is to be brought forward as collection of the following extreme factors: ignorance, primitiveness, inexperience, shallow-brainedness, alienation from reality, unintellect, unsageness, idiocy, thoughtlessness, unreasonableness, short-sightedness, limitedness, narrow-mindedness, lack of understanding, prejudice, bigotry, superficiality, intolerance, unimaginativeness, blunt consciousness, stupidity, rationality-less, senselessness, foolish talking, uneducatedness, unknowledge, ignorance in literacy matters, poverty of knowledge, poverty of education, preposterousness, imperiousness, meaninglessness, absurdity, untalentedness, unskilledness, hybris delusion, nonsensicality, unknowledgeness, simple-mindedness, madness, ignorance, bumbling incompetence, gap of education, dullness and uninformedness, and so on.
On top of that, there would be a few other unvalues still to mention, but by and large, what you explain should be fully sufficient, because all of it corresponds to what belongs to the definition of foolishness. However, I would now still like to elaborate on what you have mentioned with regard to this. Concerning the declining intelligence of the human beings of Earth, the earthly scientists do not find the true origin of the whole thing, which has arisen in a gene impairment caused by horror within 66 years, namely starting with the Second World War, 1914-1918, which was then followed by the Third World War, 1939-1945. By the year 1980, due to during two world wars horror-based damaged human beings of Earth, a genetic damage had come about in 1,000 millionfold, which was passed on to the post-war descendants. This had the consequence that the hereditary factors began to have such an effect on the offspring that, on the one hand, to an increasing extent, damages began to appear in the thought and feeling world, and thereby also in the psyche, which damages also led to severe behavioral disorders. The whole of the two world wars caused a genetic change in the human beings of Earth, which, in addition to the ancient genetic manipulation, increased the aggressiveness, while on the third side, the intelligence began to be impaired. Fourthly, through the industrialization and the ever-increasing luxury-based mode of life, it arose that latter became more and more oriented towards carelessness in life, idleness, enjoyment as well as deterioration of life, and thereby towards a general absence of interest and towards a letting go. Avoiding, neglecting, missing, giving up of learning and of all necessary and important concerns of life. Thereby, due to the impairment of genes, a building-up deterioration of consciousness and intelligence developed, which began to spread more and more since the 1980s, and which continues to this day and will still occur in the near future. This has already been particularly noticeable since the last 36 years, namely through both the constantly increasing aggressiveness as well as through the acts of violence against life and limb of the fellow human beings. This is also linked to malignant perversions in every conceivable respect. Just as fundamentally illiteracy also arises from this reduction in intelligence, as does a poverty of learning and an absence of interest regarding the protection of human life and all life of the nature and the entire fauna and flora. Particularly noticeable is this far-reaching degeneration of consciousness among the bulk of the average and middle-class human beings of Earth by the fact of their diminishing intelligence. While those others who set themselves higher goals, study assiduously, acquire a good general education, vocational training, and a good mastery of their capabilities, as well as lead a progressive life conduct, continue to build up their intelligence slowly but surely and steadily. Unfortunately, however, it must on that nevertheless be said that even with these human beings of Earth there is the danger of the reduction in intelligence, if thereby also the naturally occurring negative is not processed very attentively and correctly, and a negative succumbing is not avoided. What has now emerged from the genes influencing horrors of the Second and Third World Wars, as well as through the entire life conduct of the new times, starting in 1844 and the more progressive living conditions in connection with the entire innovations regarding all work, activities and living circumstances as well as easements of life, etc., has for a period of 136 years in general rapidly fostered the intelligence. Afterwards, however, from the beginning of the Second World War in the year 1914, a progressing genes-based negative change came about in the human being of Earth, namely with regard to an at first imperceptible impairment of the intelligence, which due to the Third World War became still slightly stronger from 1939 onwards, however in such a way that the impairment established itself definitively in the consciousness. From this it came about that thus, since the beginning of the Second World War in the year 1914, within the period of about 66 years, namely until 1980, with regard to the intelligence of the majority of the human beings of Earth, imperceptible to the scientists. The factor of the weakness of intelligence, however, continuously built up, which from that year onwards gave room to an intelligence reduction that slowly began to have a damaging effect. The reason that this fact was not noticed by the earthly scientists was based on the fact that only certain better social classes were observed and assessed, who, through better schooling, had a major increase in intelligence to record. Something which manifested itself because of the rapid electronics and technical as well as medical developments, which will also continue to be the case. Thereby, however, inspirational extraterrestrial powers also played a part to promote the overall development in every respect. Nevertheless, however, those human beings of Earth were also drawn into much that was negative in terms of consciousness, as a result of which they drifted more and more away from the humanness and from the true sense of life, wherethrough they too are at a disadvantage in these respects. And because their decline in intelligence in this respect, which also applied to the entire average and middle-class society, remained unnoticed for many decades and their analysis was neglected. Namely, ever since 1914, when we were able to evaluate the first analyses of descendants, the whole thing has not become public. Nor has it been recognized or known to this day that the tremendous horrors of the war crimes and acts of war, etc. of the last two world wars have caused bad genes-based influences and resulting impairments of intelligence in the majority of human beings of Earth, just as has happened with all other acts of turmoil and war since time immemorial, but as a result of missing information to a much lesser extent, and is also happening at present time, but will also happen in the times to come. All these genes-damaging horrors are passed on to the descendants, triggering aggressions and a readiness to use G-Vault tilde violence and cause the intelligence to deteriorate more and more, wherethrough an expanding devolution of intelligence arises. And these intelligence impairments in the form of an intelligence diminution has since the mid-1980s been spreading imperceptibly more and more, since it has since that time started to take hold efficaciously and is now spreading worldwide. And what has increasingly come about since then in great numbers and through ever more blatant manifestations and excesses, acts of G-Vault tilde violence, murders, family tragedies, rapes, worldwide uprisings, civil and wars between peoples as well as felonies of all kinds, and the likewise worldwide affecting terrorism, has come about until today and will also continue to come about, that manifests itself in very negative and ever more malignant terms in the way that everything around the world is being expressed. This is particularly noticeable in the industrialized countries, like especially in the whole of Europe and in the USA, where in the societal average and middle classes the education and intelligence of young persons and 30-45-year-olds of both sexes is becoming more and more precarious in a negative form. But the whole thing is also visible in Arab and African as well as Far Eastern and also other states, where autocracies and effective dictatorships as well as also terrorist and criminal organizations, etc., still predominate.
Thank you for your remarks and explanations. My question related to what is written in this article here, which I received from Occam Wolf. You should read this publication of the 5th of December, because the whole thing is roughly in line with what you have explained.
So that was the reason? Good, then I want to read it.
Ptaah reads the article.
The Triumph of Stupidity. Human Intelligence is Rapidly Declining, published on the 5th of December, 2016 in World of Anonymous, from Deutsche Wirtschaftsnachrichten.
By 2050, the average IQ will drop to 86. Until about 10 years ago, the intelligence in the developed world was rising because of improving living conditions. But this trend now seems to be reversing. The global poverty prevents education. The mental note: consciousness-based inactivity of broad sections of the population is increasing. The governments benefit from this development because they can manipulate the citizens more easily. While the world population is rising, the global intelligence quotient IQ seems to be falling. In the 1950s, the average human IQ reached its peak for the time being. Since then, it has already fallen by 3 percentage points, and researchers expect a further decline of the human intelligence. This disproves the so-called Flynn effect, according to which the humankind is becoming ever more intelligent. In a study, Michael A. Woodlea, Jan Tinijenhuis, and Reagan Murphy tested the reaction time of human beings of today compared to the Victorian era. Reaction time is considered an indication of IQ. Their result, in the late 19th century, the reaction time to the given stimulus averaged 194 milliseconds. In the year 2004, the span was 275 milliseconds. 200 years ago, human beings, therefore, had a better reaction time than today, which is seen as an impartial aspect of a higher intelligence. The University of Hartford has published a calculation that results in the average IQ for the year 2011 being 88.54, a significant drop compared to the preceding years. Studies in countries such as New Zealand, Australia, Brazil, and Mexico have shown that there is a direct correlation between population growth and the decline in IQ. It is assumed that the average IQ will fall to 86.32 by the year 2050 if the world population grows at a sustained high pace. In 1950, it was still at 91.64, more than 5 points higher. Perhaps there is also a direct link between the decline in IQ and poverty rates. The poverty rates today are at a historically high level. As a result, many human beings are deprived of the educational chances. They cannot offer their children the possibility to develop at a high level. The relationship between education and intelligence is a topic of controversial debate in academia. However, the cognition that a higher education has effects on the intelligence quotient has meanwhile become generally accepted. An interesting example was provided some time ago by the neuroscientists Daniel Ansari from the University of Western Ontario and Harvard professor Aaron Berkowitz. Using an improvisation task, they proved that the brain activity of musically educated test persons is different and leads to better results than that of musical laymen. The results were confirmed by other studies, for example, in Austria. The researchers believe that the results do not only apply to the field of music, but also to other industries. Especially in creative industries, education is a decisive prerequisite for solving complex tasks. In the year 1988, Robert Flynn published the book, The Flynn Effect. The Flynn effect is the term used to describe the rising IQ in many Western countries between 1930 and 1980. Flynn explains the growing intelligence as a result of the better food and living conditions, as well as the better promotion of children. Flynn thereby distinguishes between the phenotypic environmental intelligence and the genotypic inherited intelligence. He already discovered that the genotypic intelligence drops by 0.57 points per generation. In the developed world, until about 10 years ago, the decline in the genotypic intelligence was compensated by an increase in the phenotypic intelligence. In this context, it is worth noting, for 10 years, the IQ has apparently also been declining in the developed world. This is shown, for example, by studies in Denmark. There, the military fitness of all young men is examined, even if only some of them actually carry out the military service. This examination also includes an IQ test. Since 1998, the scores have dropped by an average of 1.5 points, reports the New Scientist, and this despite the fact of continued favorable living conditions in the prosperous country of Denmark. Source: derwachter.net.
The findings listed in this article correspond to that which reflects the facts and what I have also said. While it is written that the topic is subject to a controversy with regard to education and intelligence, It is nevertheless to be expected that in the course of time it will be realized that education really widens the intelligence. Hence, we can end this topic.
It will, however, be sure that whatever antagonists there are will again rant against it.
That will be so, but let us now talk of something else that shall remain among us.